Ballistics expert Howard Donahue came up with a theory about the Kennedy assassination that Secret Service agent George Hickey accidentally shot the president with the AR-15 rifle when he tried to return fire to the shooter in the window and fell over. Bonner-Menninger added to that theory by showing that the early model AR-15s had a too heavy firing pin that could cause the weapon to spontaneously fire even without the trigger being pulled, in an event called slam fire. There is a lot to like about Donahue's theory. The double bang, impossible for Oswald's weapon alone. The gun smoke knows witnesses, not only in Dealey Plaza, but all the way to Parkland Hospital, and even inside Parkland Hospital. Again, impossible for Oswald's weapon. The 6mm back of the head entry wound being too small to have come from a 6.5mm Carcano bullet, but just the right size to have come from a 5.56mm AR-15 bullet. The accounts of an agent falling like he was killed too, the ear witnesses who believed the knoll or the car itself was the source of a shot or shots, Hickey's agitated or distraught state of mind after the assassination, the puff of smoke seen by multiple witnesses. And it explains why none of the agents from the follow-up car, except for Clint Hill, who wasn't in the car at the time of the headshot, were called to testify under oath. We think Donahue was correct about the AR-15 accident involving George Hickey. But there are problems with the rest of Donahue's original theory. For one thing, Donahue accepted a 3-shot scenario, believing that Oswald had only fired 2 shots. We don't. He believed that the first shot was a miss or ricochet, apparently the miss that caused Taig's wounds. We don't. We'll discuss the first shot in more detail in a later episode. Donahue accepted the single bullet theory. We don't. Donahue accepted the higher cowlick entry, the one that the autopsy doctors disavowed. We don't. Donahue was right about the AR-15 accident, but not about the rest of his theory. His mistakes were due to his reliance on evidence that was fabricated. Here's the rest of Donahue's theory beyond the AR-15 accident, the parts we disagree with.
The Carcano that Oswald used. So the first bullet hit to the right and rear and sprayed debris from the bullet up into the car. All right. Now, let me show you the back of this, too, because this is one of the strange things about it.
Okay, hold it up like this.
Okay. Can you see this right above my fingertip?
Yeah.
There is a piece of a fragment of metal embedded, as they say, in the outer table of President Kennedy's skull. Now, if you look at your own little fingernail, it is about that size.
That's right.
That projectile struck Kennedy, and Kennedy knew that he was hit at that time, and he actually said, "My God, I am hit." Now, the Warren Commission claims that the first bullet went through Kennedy's throat. Well, we know that it exited right below Kennedy's voice box, and he couldn't have said anything. And incidentally, it was Secret Agent Roy Kellerman who heard him say that. So that's in the Warren report, that President Kennedy actually spoke clearly and intelligibly after the first shot. Kellerman was even asked how he knew it was Kennedy. He said, "Well, I've been with him for years, and I'd never forget that Harvard accent."
So the first shot Oswald fired, you're saying, missed the car, but
missed the
bullets,
car.
It ricocheted, fragmented, and one piece came and hit him in the skull back here.
Later on, we found from the Senate Select Committee on Assassinations that there were a whole series of fragments, not only to medial or lateral to this, but there were some actually in his scalp, not underneath it, but in it. They could only come from outside.
The second shot was the one that entered in the back?
The second
came
shot,
through his throat?
Correct. The second shot entered in either high in the back or low in the neck, struck the 6th cervical vertebrae and exited off the right-hand side and exited about the 3rd tracheal ring. Now, if any of the viewers that they want to can feel their larynx right here and about right where his tie is where your 3rd tracheal ring is.
Okay, we saw the picture. We're going to see pictures of him clutching. Then the third shot you say was the shot from the Secret Service agent.
The third shot was fired from a high-velocity weapon that struck President Kennedy in the head, almost disintegrating his skull.
Okay, we're with Howard Donahue, and we will return in just a moment.
Basically, we don't like Donahue's ricochet theory, which was based on Roy Kellerman's testimony and a misinterpretation of another witness's testimony, and for a few other reasons we'll discuss when we get into our other episodes dealing with the specific shots. And we're not going to reiterate all the reasons the single bullet theory is BS in this episode. Donahue liked it, but we don't. We'll explain all the Kennedy wounds attributed to the single bullet theory in a later episode. We'll explain more about why we like the EOP entry rather than the cowlick in a later episode too. This article, insisting that the EOP entrance was correct, was published the same year that Mortal Error came out. We wonder if the reiterations made in 1992 might have been an attempt to discredit Donahue's AR-15 accident theory. We do think the EOP was the correct entrance, but the EOP entry would mean, of course, that Donahue's trajectory wasn't quite right. Some critics of Donahue's theory argue that if Donahue got his trajectory wrong, if the true entry wound really was the EOP, then Donahue's whole theory falls apart. It does not. It just means he got his trajectory wrong. Howard Donahue primarily liked the cowlick entry because of what he saw in the extant Zapruder film in the frame immediately before the explosive headshot. Given Kennedy's head position, an EOP entry with the Warren Commission's approximate exit location would trace back to an upward trajectory. So are we back to this? A shot from the trunk of the car? The answer to that question can be found in the Zapruder film, the supposed time clock of the assassination, or so Donahue and many other researchers thought. There is a growing body of evidence that the Zapruder film, as we know it, is not exactly what came out of Zapruder's camera, that it is an altered film, a forgery, a hoax. We concur. How do we know the Zapruder film is not authentic? Well, for one thing, nowhere in the Zapruder film do we see Officer Cheney peering into the car as he does in the Altgen 6 photograph. So, okay, that's odd. There are some technical issues, like the blur mistake that John Costella describes. Between the apparent movement of the car, the apparent movement of Zapruder's camera, the non-moving background, and the shutter speed of Zapruder's camera, there should be a certain amount of blur in each of the frames, depending on the speed of the limousine as it traveled down Elm Street. That blur should be divided up between the limousine and its occupants and the people and objects in the background. And yet, frames like these were perfectly focused with no blur, indicating that neither the camera nor the limousine was moving, or that the camera, the limousine, and the background were all moving at the same rate of speed. Of course, it was impossible for the background to move. Signs and trees and walls and so on are stationary. In the Warren Commission documents, where individual frames of the Zapruder film were published, there were a number of problems. For example, the published images start at frame 171, even though the limousine appears on the street at frame 133. The numbering jumps from frame 207 to frame 212. Where are the frames in between? If you look closely, you can see that both of these frames are spliced. Here's the splice in frame 207. Well, the top and bottom do sort of look like they go together, but the two images that created the frame labeled 212 do not go together at all. You can see the top of the tree and the bottom of the trunk of the tree are separated. You can see the head and top torso of the running girl, Rosemary Willis, is much farther to the right than the bottom of her torso and legs. This splice was later explained as an accident that occurred in the Life magazine photo lab. But not to worry, a copy of the film was later produced containing the missing frames. However, there was something missing in the recovered frames. The sprocket area images were cut off. We are skeptical that the frames 207 and 212 splices were really an accident. I mean, to treat the most important film of the 20th century so carelessly? Really? And for a copy of those same frames to be so precisely edited? So what was in the sprocket area? Secret Service men, and specifically George Hickey. By frame 212 on the bottom, Hickey's gone. We know what you're thinking. Isn't that him right there? But if you follow the line of the top passenger side of the follow-up car, you can see that that person has to be Jack Reddy. Where Hickey should be, there's a bit of a ghost-like figure, but it's not a solid person. We don't believe in ghosts, but we do believe in film alteration. And by the next frame, 213, the apparent camera pan to the right cuts off any trace of where Hickey should be, and we very shortly lose sight of the follow-up car altogether. In the Warren Commission documents, there was a reversal and mislabeling of frames immediately after the explosive headshot, which takes a sharp eye, like David Lifton's, to spot. You can tell by the position of the foot of the woman in the background and her distance from the man standing behind her. This reversal was explained as an accidental printing error. The effect of the reversal was to reduce the rapid back and to the left head snap following the headshot. There was also a splice so obvious that it looked like Zapruder had simply stopped filming and then started back up again. But Zapruder seemed to think he filmed the limousine turning from Houston Street onto Elm Street.
And as I was shooting, as the president was coming down from Houston Street making his turn.
And he reiterated that he had wanted to film the limousine making its turn in his Warren Commission testimony. We think he did film it. Here's a spliced frame that wasn't even in the blurry black and white images published in the Warren Commission's hearings and exhibits. The first image published by the Commission was frame 171. Here's another splice from 2 frames earlier, also not published by the Warren Commission. And like the frames with the missing sprocket areas and other problematic frames, this frame is not found on all websites containing Zapruder film frames. And the piecemeal splice work for this frame has never been explained. We have an explanation: hasty film alteration. And then there's the fact that some witnesses reported the limousine as stopping, which of course doesn't appear in the Zapruder film.
And I do know that the car itself that Kennedy was in, it hesitated and stopped there for a second or two.
Hugh Betzner saw it stop. The mayor's wife saw it stop. Mary Ann Moorman called it a hesitation.
Did you notice any other reaction to persons around him, around the president in the motorcade there at the time of the shot?
Oh, they hesitated just for a moment because I think they were like I was, was that a shot, is it a backfire, or just what? And then, of course, he touched himself, and they immediately set up real fast, you know, like to get out of there.
In fact, witnesses seem to have described two separate instances of a stop or near stop, one just after the turn onto Elm Street, and then another further down Elm Street in front of the grassy knoll. At least one researcher has said that the Muchmore film demonstrates that frames have been removed from the Zapruder film. But we don't really need the Muchmore film for that. We can even see in the extant Zapruder film that the brake lights come on, although the limousine never seems to slow. Alterations to the film went beyond just creative splicing and removal of frames. There's evidence of more extensive alteration. For example, there are some tells right as the limousine is about to disappear under the triple underpass. Keep your eye on both Clint Hill and the lamp post. In frame 455, his legs seem to have disappeared, replaced by a gray blob that might be the roadway. In frame 456, the light gray blob where his legs should be is replaced by a dark gray blob. Maybe that's supposed to be the tire well, but it's not the same color as the blob in the previous frame, and it's not round, and it shouldn't be covering that much of his body. He disappears altogether in frame 457. He reappears in frame 458, but notice how the lamp post has jumped from the near side of the street to the far side in this frame, and how he is now apparently straddling the tire well, apparently in just 2/18 of a second since we last saw him. The chrome limousine bumper cuts across the bottom of the tire well, making it look like slightly more than half a tire or a very flat tire rather than a full round tire. And by frame 459, Clint Hill's legs seem to have melted through the top of the trunk, and the chrome bumper is a couple of feet higher than it was in the previous frame. Something ain't right. We'll show you the same images side by side for comparison. In frames 455 and 456, notice how Clint Hill barely seems to be at the back of the limousine, and his legs are seemingly invisible. The roadway, or tire well, or whatever it's supposed to be, looks more like a black-gloved finger covering part of the lens in frame 456 than the round, pavement-colored hole punch in frame 455. In frame 457, he seems to have largely disappeared. Maybe that's supposed to be his head on the other side of the lamp post? We're not sure, but that dark area is at the same relative location to the lamp post as the dark area in frame 456, which is apparently a shadow against the far wall and is most definitely not Clint Hill's head, which is to the left of the lamp post in 456. No legs in either of these pictures, and notice how the lamp post is on the near side of the street in all these images, because in the next frame, 458, the lamp post has jumped to the far side of the street, which of course is a physical impossibility. Also in frame 458, Clint reappears and he finally has legs, or a leg anyway. He looks like he stepped into a hole at the back of the trunk with his right foot and leg. In frame 459, the lamp post is back on the near side of the street. Clint Hill looks like he's made it completely inside the car, which is amazing athleticism considering that he was still at the back of the car in the previous frame just 1/18 of a second earlier. Here's Gerda Dunkel's analysis of the same frames showing dead JFK rising in his seat. The composite alterations don't just apply to these ending frames. There are other tells. For example, we have to ask whether Governor Connolly's jump seat was actually as cushy as it appears here. And the answer is no. And what about Kennedy's super long left arm, which rises in front of Connolly's seat back? Here it is in motion. We'll show it a few times, a little slower and more zoomed in each time. Then there's our favorite tell. In these same frames, watch the limousine flag, which passes between the waving bystander, dubbed the dark-complected man by many researchers, and the camera, which is, like the lamppost jumping from one side of the street to the other side of the street, another physical impossibility. We also note how large the guy's hand is and how the thumb looks more like an ear. There's this character dubbed Stickman by some researchers, for obvious reasons. And what about the improbable reflections surrounding Kennedy's head and expanding outwards in the early frames? We call this the circle of light. It's more Hollywood special effects than actual reflections off anything. If we take a really close look at one of these frames, we can see how the circle of light effectively helps to hide Kennedy's face, along with a simple blanking out of his features. It also helps distract us from paying close attention to things like Kennedy's weird hands. These so-called reflections aren't real. If we look at the spots of light, we can see how some of them behave more like 3D objects, like the reflections on the follow-up car that have shadows. It's important to note that the film was never intended to be released to the American public. It was supposed to be kept locked up in the vaults at Life magazine forever. When New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison wanted the film for the trial of Clay Shaw, he had to file a subpoena to obtain so much as a copy. At that point, it was covertly copied, and underground copies began to circulate amongst researchers. In the meantime, Life wasn't taking advantage of the motion picture rights that they had bought, and only occasionally published a few still frame images. Alterations to the Zapruder film, to tell a different story than what actually happened, would explain Zapruder's confusion upon given images that were supposedly of his film during his Warren Commission testimony. Remember, Zapruder had already seen his film quite a number of times, having shown it to the FBI, Secret Service, Life magazine's representative, people like Dan Rather who were bidding on publishing rights, and an unknown number of other people before he turned it over to Life magazine. In fact, instead of being asked if the frames he was being shown were from his film, Zapruder was told that they were. Later, when asked if certain frames looked like images he had taken, Zapruder, who had been willing to dissemble about how much money he had received for his film, did agree that the images looked like the ones he had taken. How much like, we can't say. These are the images Zapruder was given to look at when he seemed confused, before the limousine goes behind the sign, and before Kennedy is apparently shot, at least in the extant film. Zapruder said of these images, "This is before. This shouldn't be there. The shot wasn't fired, was it? You can't tell from here?" He saw his film enough times that he should have known when the first shot was fired. Stick a pin in that, his confusion about the early frames of the limousine on Elm Street. But his confusion is an indication that he was expecting to see something that he wasn't seeing in the frames he was shown. Frames of the limousine before it passed behind the sign. Another way to judge the authenticity of the Zapruder film, in addition to internal anomalies, is to look at other films and photographs taken during the assassination. Because if the Zapruder film was altered, wouldn't the other assassination films and photographs have to have been altered too? In fact, they were. Supposed accidental damage seems to have occurred with an awful lot of assassination films and photographs. This is a frame from the Robert Hughes film. Orville Nix told Mark Lane that some frames from his film were damaged or went missing.
Well, you now have a copy of your film, which you were kind enough to show to us this afternoon. Is that copy the same as the original which you gave to the FBI on December 1st?
I would say no. There is some films maybe missing, some frames. Some of the frames were ruined.
Does the film which you have at the present time have the same number of frames as the film which you delivered to the FBI on December 1st?
I would say no, but it's because of losing maybe a frame here and there.
Damaged frames, missing frames, splices, those seem to be common themes. The Tina Towner film had all of that, and then some. Here we see a damaged frame with a number of frames missing after this point. Approximately 6 missing frames, according to researcher Robert Harris. But again, it's not just excising frames. Here's one of the better quality versions of the Towner film that we've found online. Keep an eye on Kennedy's head, how it seems to change shape or even partially disappear. Or watch Kellerman's head next to the driver in the front seat, which does similar things. You'll see the jump of the excised frames, but keep watching. It's a little hard to see at speed, so we'll step through it frame by frame. Inconsistencies in timing between frames is due to our manual step-through process, but the head shapes are what you're looking for. Robert Croft was certain he took a picture at the instant of the fatal shot, but when he got his pictures back from the government, that one was blacked out. The FBI told him that his camera must have malfunctioned. We're not buying it. More extensive alteration also occurred. Phil Willis took this picture and others during and after the assassination. Here's what his daughter Linda, who was a child witness at the time of the assassination, had to say.
Okay, the day of the assassination, my father volunteered to have his film turned over to the Secret Service. My family went to the Eastman Kodak plant near Love Field, and my dad was in the lab with the Secret Service and the lab technicians while the film was being developed. Okay, my dad saw the film, and behind the grassy knoll area, there were trains that day. Okay, my dad had the trains in his film. He turned his film over to the Secret Service, and the pictures were in Washington for maybe 2 to 3 weeks' time. When he received his original film back, the trains were not in 1 or 2 frames of the film. So I feel like something important showed in that film that the Secret Service did not want known.
So they didn't give you all the film back, there were frames missing, or did they physically alter the
I feel like the frame was physically altered. It was just whited out.
We think it was more than just a train that had been edited out of her father's image. We think that what the Secret Service did not want known was Hickey holding the AR-15. That, of course, is our speculation. It also appears as if the left side of Hickey's head was composited in, to make him appear to be looking more forward than down. We didn't touch his head in our composite, we just added the AR-15. You can see some funny business behind his left ear. Other sources of this image don't show his right ear at all. In fact, there are other subtle differences related to Hickey's head, so we do think this image in particular underwent a couple of steps. The removal of the train that Linda Willis described was actually corroborated by another assassination photographer, Jim Towner. With these accounts, every assassination photograph and film that passed into government hands becomes suspect. In other words, all of them. Impossible for such alterations to have occurred in 1963, you say? Even though Photoshop wasn't a thing in the early 1960s, the technology to alter photographic images has been around for a lot longer than that. For example, this photograph, apparently of Abraham Lincoln, is actually a composite forgery made with Lincoln's head superimposed over a photograph of John C. Calhoun, who was a pro-slavery politician. This composite was created nearly 100 years before the JFK assassination. And what is a film but a series of still photographs? In the 1960s, the technology to alter a film was an analog process involving an optical imaging aerial printer and crude artwork, and it left those little tells or mistakes in the compositing process that show us what we are seeing in the extant film is not authentic. There's one more important aspect of the Zapruder film alteration we need to show you, beyond the splicing and dicing and anomalous subtle tells we've already shown you. Back in the early 1960s, subliminal advertising was state-of-the-art. Since then, the efficacy of subliminal messaging has been brought into question, but back then it was the latest, greatest technology in the art of selling. Techniques included writing the word sex in subtle shading to form the letters, such as the SEX written in these ice cubes. There's a nonverbal message in the strategic placement of the cork, but right now it's just the sex message we want you to pay attention to. Because the Zapruder film got that same state-of-the-art subliminal treatment. In this case, it's not gin or cigarettes or another commercial product being sold. It's an altered, fabricated film. So where and when did all this alteration take place? Zapruder sold the still image rights to his film to Life magazine the day after the assassination. But he was wily and only sold the still image rights to Life at that point. On Monday, the day after Oswald's murder, Zapruder opened a bidding war on the motion picture rights to his film and ended up also selling the motion picture rights to Life magazine. Life never monetized its rights to the motion picture, which is interesting. We think they had to buy the motion picture rights, perhaps with some monetary assistance from the government, because the film had already been altered by that point. Life published some of the still images within a week of the assassination. At that point, the still images published by Life were more or less frozen in that those images were widely circulated. So at least a good portion of the alteration had to have happened in time for Life to choose and lay out and print the images for its spread. Thanks to the work of ARRB analyst Doug Horn, we have an even better time frame for when most of the film alteration took place. And we also know where it took place. The when was within about 60 hours of the assassination, immediately after Jack Ruby's murder of Oswald, when it was clear that there would be no trial of Oswald. The where was at the CIA's Hawkeye Works laboratory in Rochester, New York. We know this because Horn uncovered two separate events that took place at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC, NPIC, where the nation's preeminent photographic analyst, named Dino Brugioni, worked. The first event, Brugioni's, occurred the day after the assassination and involved creating briefing boards, that is, enlarged and mounted images used to brief military brass of the original Zapruder film. This event used a slit film, which makes sense because the original Zapruder film was slit when it was processed in Dallas. The second event also involved the creation of briefing boards, but this time from an altered Zapruder film, the extant film, masquerading as an unslit camera original. The second event used a different crew, which Horn describes as a deliberate compartmentalization of information to keep the right hand from knowing what the left hand was doing. The crew for this second event was told that the film came from the CIA's Hawkeye Works laboratory in Rochester, New York. That's how we know the where. This second NPIC event occurred Sunday night into the Monday morning following the assassination. The two events did not use the same film. Zapruder's camera was a double 8mm camera. The type of film it used was 16 millimeters wide, but the camera recorded only half of that at a time. When such a film is developed and processed, as was done in Dallas immediately after the assassination, the film is slit down the center and the two strips are joined together. That's why there are only sprocket holes on the left side of the Zapruder film. The first event used a slit film, which was to be expected since the film was processed and slit in Dallas. But the second NPIC event used an unslit film that came from the CIA's Hawkeye Works laboratory. The briefing boards from this second event are the ones available in the archives today. Dino Brugioni, the The CIA's top photographic analyst and the guy who processed the authentic film in the first NPIC event recounted what he saw in that film in an interview with Peter Janney. This clip is a bit long, but please bear with us. We think the information is important.
Okay, extant film, Dino. This is the only frame where you have any indication of, his brains exploding.
Oh, it went into the air. I remember it went in the air.
Was it more than one frame? It would have to have been, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, there's only one frame on the entire Zapruder film, frame 313, that gives any indication of that.
No, it was in the. I remember it was in the sky.
Yeah, but you see that's the only frame. It's just one frame. Now we go up to 335, but let's go back to 313. Okay, that's the.
There's no 314.
Yeah, there is a 314, but it has none of this, pink haze, blood water.
No, I remember all of us being shocked.
And was it going out the back when you saw it?
It was going out front.
It was going out the front.
Going up.
Up. Okay. But was it leaving a trail in the rear?
No, it was straight up.
Uh-huh.
I remember.
But if that event took place, wouldn't you suspect to see it on more than one frame?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And because you're shooting, 18 frames per second? Isn't that what that camera did?
There should have been more than one frame.
Yeah, right. There should have been. Because here now is a picture.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I remember all of us being shocked because I thought the spray was say 3 or 4 feet from his head.
Uh-huh. Up in the air?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
If you wonder why Life magazine would go along with letting the CIA take the film they had just bought, Carl Bernstein, yes, that Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame, wrote an expose article about how some media companies, specifically including Life magazine, had strong ties to the CIA. The founder of Life, Henry Luce, was a good friend of Allen Dulles, who was the CIA representative serving on the Warren Commission, and who later became the director of the CIA. The vice president of Life magazine and Luce's personal emissary to the CIA was C.D. Jackson, who gave press credentials to CIA agents working in other countries. The CIA influence probably explains why Life magazine never made a dime off its motion picture rights to the Zapruder film. The idea was to keep the film, or the altered film, out of the view of the American public and out of public scrutiny, notwithstanding the few still frames published in Life a week after the assassination and the blurry black and white images published in the Warren Commission's supplements to its reports. And it worked. For a while, anyway, until Jim Garrison, who became the central character of the Oliver Stone JFK movie, successfully subpoenaed the film for the Clay Shaw trial and allowed copies of it to leak. Eventually, Geraldo Rivera showed a copy on Good Night America, and the cat was out of the bag, so to speak. Let's take a look at what has become one of the most infamous aspects of the extant Zapruder film. Remember Oliver Stone's grassy knoll shooter? And Kevin Costner repeating, "Back and to the left, back and to the left, back and to the left," in order to emphasize the implication of a shooter from the right front, the grassy knoll shooter behind the fence? But if the film is a fabrication, then did that back and to the left head snap really happened? We don't think it did. We'll explain why not next time. So how much of the extant Zapruder film can we trust? In our view, not much at all. The so-called time clock of the assassination is really nothing of the sort. It's more of a broken clock. And if the Zapruder film was altered, along with other films and photographs taken during the assassination, how far did the cover-up extend? What about the autopsy images, the photographs and x-rays? We'll show you why that back and to the left head snap didn't really happen, and we'll take a look at the purported autopsy pictures and x-rays in our next episode, Part 5, The Images.